And we are live. Hello, everyone watching on YouTube and Facebook. I'm Mike Durrell, talking to you from the Gardenia room at the mysterious bookshop in New York City. Tonight, we are here in discussion with Mr. Charles Todd, who we are discussing the new Bess Crawford title, the 13th in that August series, The Cliff's Edge. And you'll note when you read it, and I know that's a when, that the cliff plays a major part in the plot and the tale, but we'll get to all of that. Now, Charles, I understand that a new Ian Rutledge is going to be birthed very, very soon.
Well, it's going into my agent this week. I will take it one step at a time.
So the agent is just about to have it handed over.
Right.
Very good. We're all going to be looking forward to that because everyone who is listening to this is a huge Ian Rutledge fan, including myself. So
I did not know that downstairs room was called the Gardenia room.
Well, I call it that. I don't think anyone else does.
I've been in that room.
Is that right?
Yes.
It's in one of the big famous hotels here in New York.
Absolutely.
They did live broadcasts of the big band stuff and all that. I
right.
learned that from my father. These many years ago.
The Roosevelt Hotel.
Yeah, that's right. Still there, up on 45th, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, it's still there.
Very good. Now, the new Bess Crawford, The Cliff's Edge. What was the extent of your involvement as opposed to Caroline, your late mom?
Well, Caroline and I always use when we first started writing, there were a couple of basic things. First of all, there was no co-authors for dummies book out there. And I later learned from being on panels and moderating panels with co-authors, no two do it the same. And it took us a long time for the two of us, as old movie buffs, we took it scene by scene. She would write the scene, I would write the scene, then we would put them together, quibble, disagree, talk about it, decide, okay, we've got that resolved. Now, what's next? What's the next quote unquote scene in the book? And then we would go off and write it. And it was kind of helpful because I tend to work early in the morning and Caroline worked into the wee hours of the night. So there was a pretty smooth transfer. But when we wrote the first Rutledge, it took us, oh my goodness, well, it took 2 years to write that book. And so we really had to figure out what would work and what wouldn't work for us.
That's good to kind of walk us through the process. So it was very much a collaborative effort. It wasn't along the lines of you wrote one chapter, she wrote a chapter, and this.
Well, that doesn't work because if I don't know what takes place in chapter 1, how can I write chapter 2?
A fair point.
The other thing was critical to our work was people pick up a book to read a story. They don't want to be interrupted. Oh my goodness, it's a different chapter. It's a different point of view. It's a different whatever.
Or a consistent voice.
They want a consistent voice throughout the book that they become at home with and feel comfortable with and follow the story. We want them to read the story.
Sure.
Not all that other, not all those other distractions. So that was our guiding principle. We always believed in two basic things. One, is it a story that people will be able to read and enjoy? And two, when we came into disagreements over the thing, underlying principle was, what is best for Rutledge or for Bess? Not, and as a result, the funny thing is, I couldn't pick up this book right here and say, see this right here? I wrote this paragraph.
Yeah, I was gonna ask that. I wouldn't be surprised, and you've confirmed it, that if you go back to the previous titles and look at a paragraph or even a chapter, that you couldn't tell who came up with which idea because of the diligence that you did in making a consistent voice within the story. So I would say that a popular series, and you've done not one but two popular series, creates a legacy for yourself and your sadly late mom that will outlive us all, and that's got to be a very gratifying feeling.
I hope so. The
Absolutely.
main thing was we wanted to carry on the storytelling tradition that really went back to my mother's father. When I was a kid, we would go down and sit on the porch at night, and my granddaddy would tell stories, and it wasn't so much the story itself, but the way he told it. I could tell you that story right now, but you wouldn't find it anywhere near as entertaining as it was when he did it. And it got to a point where I would ask him to tell certain stories that were favorites of mine, and they always seemed fresh. And so that is a long-standing, I'm biased here. I'm going to say it's a Southern tradition, but I'm sure it's elsewhere as well.
I think so, but the oral tradition has lent itself well to so many people growing up in that tradition and carrying on and writing stories in books and in film and things like that. So it's extremely important, kind of a building block, if you will, for a writing career. So that's good. Good work. Now, the new Bess Crawford finds her in Yorkshire. And does she plan to stick around, do you think? Might she go a little further afield?
Well, in this particular instance, she got a letter from Melinda Crawford, who is related to Bess's father, asking for a favor, basically. She knew this woman who was the companion to Lady Beatrice. Lady Beatrice was a force unto herself.
She most certainly is. And I understand that from my reading, Bess was trying to recommend somebody else and kind of deflect the...
That was the whole idea. She was supposed to pretty much... The reason she was going up there was to help Lillian convince Lady Beatrice that she needed a competent nurse to stay with her. But when you're a strong-willed person, Lady Beatrice took one look at Bess and said, "You'll do nicely, thank you. You can stick around."
You're in.
And, Bess didn't really, that was not her intention when she went up there. She wasn't there to be a nurse to an elderly person who was going through gallbladder surgery.
She was headed up in that direction to visit a friend of her own.
Right. She had a friend of hers staying in York and newly married, and she was looking forward to going up. And it was, sure, I'll stop by and talk to this lady as a favor to Melinda and her friend Lillian, and we'll proceed from there, and then I'll visit my friend and come back home. Well, as you well know, it never works out that way, which is good for us.
Absolutely. You know? That would have been a 5-page novel.
Yes, it would have. It wouldn't even have made a short story. So Lady Beatrice decides that Bess is going to stay. And Bess agrees to do that, but before Lady Beatrice even gets home, they get a disturbing call from Scarfdale from Mrs. Neville telling her that, well, actually, it's not from Mrs. Lovell that the phone call came from one of her sons saying that there'd been a terrible accident and they needed to reach Lady Beatrice. Well, Lady Beatrice was in the hospital, but as soon as she got word, she sends Bess, you're a qualified nurse, somebody's injured, go. I'll be along behind you. And it winds up being a very interesting tale about two different families that are intertwined, and before it's all said and done, they become even more intertwined.
They certainly do. One of the gentlemen in question were seeking stray sheep and ewes, and there was an accident along the cliff's edge. One was killed, one was grievously injured, so it seems. And
Gordon Neville was out looking for some sheep when Frederick Caldwell was out there with him. He was up there because it was Mrs. Neville's upcoming birthday, and the ladies were all off in York shopping, and he and Frederick went out to scan for sheep that had wandered off, and they both went off the edge of the cliff, and
one landed on the other.
One died and one didn't. And then when they start to delve into the story about the two men, there were all kinds of complications that upset Frederick Caldwell's family, and they descended, and the Nevilles were there in their own home, and we had an inspector who was had pretty much made up his mind before he even showed up who did what. And
yes, he did. I've had some feedback. The cops in this tale come across as kind of, well, to be frank, arrogant jerks.
Well,
to some.
I think that's a fair analysis of the situation. He doesn't like to be told his business.
But he did rush to judgment, as you say.
Well, but he had some foundation there because the two men didn't get along. They both fancied the same woman, and she married one and not the other, and that caused some serious friction between the two. So there was the natural assumption on the part of the Yorkshire inspector, who was part of the constabulary, that well, in that case, Gordon just kind of like got rid of the competition. And
that's doing it the hard way.
As with most things, it turns out to be a lot more complicated than that. And in the end, not only do they have those complications, but Bess is present when something comes forward that has a direct bearing on her family and Simon.
Simon. Now,
he really doesn't make an appearance in this book, but he does.
His presence is felt. Just like the doggy.
Yes.
Say hello. Here's Otto.
Hey, Charles. I just want to say hello.
Hey, Otto. Good to see you.
And you. Welcome to the show. Thank you for being here.
Thank you. I didn't realize you had renamed this the Gardenia Room.
Just my pet name.
You take care. It's good to see you. Thank you. Thanks again for doing this. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure.
Okay.
Folks, if you're just tuning in, that was Otto Penzler, the chief man of the Mysterious Bookshop since day one and carrying on. I'm Mike Durrell. We are at the Mysterious Bookshop talking to Mr. Charles Todd, the author of the new Bess Crawford mystery, The Cliff's Edge. Now, over the course of the tale, and maybe the last couple too, Bess seems to be slightly adrift, without a clear direction as to where she wants to go. Surely she isn't waiting for the next World War to give her life some meaning.
Well, that wouldn't be good for the series now, would it?
Nope, especially since the next World War is 25 years off.
Yes. Bess has resigned her position with Queen Alexandria's Imperial Nursing Corps. And that does begin a new chapter in her life, and it starts in an Irish hostage, which was the one previous to The Cliff's Edge, and it continues. The primary reason why Bess was so willing to go talk to Lady Beatrix was that she was feeling claustrophobic and wanted to get out of the house, so to speak. And there were some lingering issues between her and Simon had not been around very much. She can't tell if he was avoiding her or what the situation was, but after the situation in Ireland, Bess isn't sure exactly where things are going to go. And in many ways, The Cliff's Edge, even though Simon does not make an appearance, this book definitely involves Simon.
It does. And many, if not most, fans of Bess's stories are clamoring for she and Simon to, as the young people say nowadays, hook up. Now, I know we can't do any spoilers or anything like that, but let me ask this. Will we see a little more of Simon in the future and see what he's up to?
Well, Simon's an important character in the series.
Sure.
And so naturally, he will always be around. Those people who read A Hanging at Dawn got some insight into Simon's background, where he came from when he entered the army, and his relationship with Bess. He had always sort of been an older brother as well as someone that was close to the family.
Right.
And has always looked out for Bess. And that's taken place in quite a number of the books.
Doesn't seem to start out as any kind of a romantic thing, certainly. As you say, more of an older brother relationship, really.
Well,
he seems increasingly distant.
In the end of An Irish Hostage, they kind of crossed that line. Ooh. And Bess hadn't really, nothing untoward as you would expect, but it was an unresolved issue that came from An Irish Hostage. It was also in An Irish Hostage that she decided to resign. And now Bess is contemplating what the next step in her life is going to be. And so when this distraction, so to speak, came up, she was more than happy to go on the premise that she was just going to stop by, say hello, right, say a few words, and then leave. But no matter what happens, when Bess gets involved in a situation, I think it's the one thing she and Rutledge have in common. They're both tenacious.
The cliche, I think, for Bess is plucky. She's very plucky.
Yes.
But I wonder...
That was the way we designed that. Well, design is the wrong word. That was the way we came up with Bess. Not only had we come across several stories that would have fit better for an amateur detective that just we had to set aside because they didn't fit a police procedural like Rutledge. But also, we had written The Murder Stone, which was a female protagonist throughout the book. It was a book that we really enjoyed writing because we were able to delve into the woman's point of view of that terrible war. And so we made the mistake one day. We were sitting in Carolyn Marino's office at HarperCollins and said, we were thinking about, and Carolyn said, that's great. And you'll have the manuscript ready for me when? We're like, we were just chatting about it.
Humana.
Yeah. But it's given us the opportunity to show the women's perspective of that war and also delve into what young women of Bess's age were going through, because England throughout the war radically changed. The role of women, in the United States, we talk about Rosie the Riveter in World War II. That was World War I in England. Suddenly, women were driving lorries and delivering the mail and filling in, whether it was working the fields or working in the cities, or as we did in a Bess book, munitions plant.
By necessity, the lost generation, whole generation of men just plain gone.
Yes. And as a result, the people Bess's age, suddenly that whole part of their society wasn't there anymore, and they were taking on responsibilities that they'd never taken on before. And so you've got that, plus Bess is part of, after World War I is really the time, once you get into the 20s, is the more modern day England than it was. Yes, Edward had died before the war.
1910.
So it was 1910, the Black Ascot, as a matter of fact. But George V was on the throne, but it was still pretty much Edwardian society.
Yeah, sure.
Leading into World War I. After World War I, completely different. You had the influence of Americans suddenly in England, on their way to France. They came into England, then went on to France. Some were based in England. So you had that whole new jazz era, hip and with it type of American coming in all of a sudden that they had never been exposed to, certainly not in those kinds of numbers. The change in the role of women, the advances in terms of, if you look at, for example, a motor car that was built right before a 1914 Ghost like Rutledge drives, and you compare it to a 1920 car, they don't even look the same. The whole world really changed.
Major upheavals.
Yes.
The Austro-Hungarian Empire disappeared overnight, just about.
Just about. The final nail in the coffin was World War II, but the British Empire was beginning to crumble after World War I.
The sun finally set.
Unfortunately, it did. But that just blew open all kinds of opportunities with Bess, because she's athletic. She grew up as the daughter of a British regimental colonel. She spent many of her formative years there on post with her mother and father in India. She's the kind of person that's not afraid of a little blood, and she understands the military thoroughly. So when she was a nurse during the war, she fit right in, but fit right in from her own perspective. That's been the interesting thing about Bess. Bess is a story told in first person.
Yes.
Rutledge is not. It's third person. So
a conscious decision right from the beginning?
No, we started out Bess as third person and it just didn't work.
If it didn't work for you, it wouldn't work for us.
We kept going back and forth over it, and finally we decided to try it in first person, and it worked. And so we, with Duty to the Dead, which was the first Bess Crawford novel that came out, it has been in first person ever since. And it's good. It gives, you're seeing the world as Bess sees it, as a young, from a good family, but also very a modern day woman.
I would say so. I've heard it said that for the Rosie the Riveter situation in World War II, after the conflict was over, it wasn't the men coming back expected the women not to join the workplace as equals or anything like that, but to go back into the kitchen, to go back into the home and know their place, so to speak. But I don't think Bess is really going to do that. And I think it
didn't work out very well. They
just expanded everything so much.
Put everything back in the jar and put the lid on.
There's no way you can get that toothpaste back in the tube, so to speak.
Yeah. And all of a sudden, both in the United States and in England, all of a sudden women had the right to vote. Now, in England, there were certain provisions. You had to be, if I remember correctly, 35. You had to have certain land, and there were lots of caveats. Whereas in the United States in 1919, they were fully emancipated. They weren't fully emancipated, but it was a major step. It was after World War I that the British government took a tremendous gamble and opened up voting to people in the country that had never had the right to vote before. And they didn't know at that time in 1919 what all these new voters were going to say and what kind of influence they would have. As it turned out, the gamble paid off and everything stayed just fine. But you never know.
Nope. In the reading I've done, a lot of people were very much opposed in this country anyway to giving women the vote in 1920. And I would hope that if they tried to say things like that now, they'd be laughed out of the room. Unfortunately, that isn't as cut and dried as it should be, it seems, in the 2023 era. But given her...
That's the nice thing about writing historical novels. I don't have to get into modern day politics. Caroline and I used to tell people that she belonged to one party, I belonged to another party, and we weren't going to tell which one was which.
Well, I just figure you would be part of the Whig party, and then the but it's a good thing. That's what's great about historicals. You're absolutely right, because if someone says, well, this wouldn't have happened that way, well, how do you know? Were you there in 1873 or 1919 or whatever? No, you weren't. All right, so be quiet. So with Bess's experience in the military and nursing experience, she could go into medicine. Perhaps I could see her just storming into the Queen's Medical College and saying, I'm a candidate for doctor now, and just taking the bull by the horns. But even after the war and after a bit of opening up, women's roles were still somewhat constrained in terms of employment, were they not?
Yes, they were. There was a great fear that they wanted the veterans that came home who were still able to work had a job. It was still that philosophy, just as, from 1945 through, well, basically up until the 1960s, the United States was very much the uh, typical leave it to beaver kind of house.
You could there's two parts of the next question. I'm wondering, after the war, was it easier to find Bess in a situation where there's a body or a crime, a murder that needs to be solved during the war when bodies were all over the place? Or is it more difficult now after the war when you have to contrive situations a little more? Or is it freeing because you don't have to be on a battlefield setting? You can go anywhere you want.
We were tricky. One of Bess's duties as a Quames nurse was to escort severely injured patients back to England. There were several books involving that. An Impartial Witness had to do with that. When she came back and had a gentleman that was receiving an honor from the king and then all of a sudden disappeared. I'd like to tell you that I've got all 40 novels completely intact in my brain, but it comes and goes. But so we and then on the other end, we had things like The Shattered Tree, which was definitely involved the front and the troops and what was going on there. We had A Question of Honor, where in amongst the pile of corpses, Bess finds out that there's one who died some other way that made things interesting. So we were able to dabble in a little bit of both. The very first book, Duty to the Dead, she was taking care of a young man who was dying, and his last request to her was, when she got back to England, to pass a certain message along to his family. And she was a little iffy about it, but ultimately she decided she would. And the next time she was home on leave, she went and carried that message to the family. And that whole mystery developed. So it's kind of a little bit of both. Or something as simple as an Irish hostage. In A Duty to the Dead, there was a young Irish nurse who had her legs mangled in the propeller as the Britannic sank. And Bess was able to get her pretty well taken care of, but she promised that she would dance at her wedding. And so after the war was over, she agreed to come to Ireland to dance at her wedding. And then we got to Ireland and we found all kinds of things to get into over there too.
To say the least. I have a feeling if Bess were a real character, there would never have been any kind of troubles in Ireland at all. She would fix that right up.
We tried. The biggest thing is it has to be a reason that has some semblance of believability to it, if that's a word.
What's the word? Verisimilitude or something like that?
Yeah. That you can't just, all of a sudden Bess is walking down the street, trips over a dead guy. We're very careful. Murder, She Wrote was a great series, but we used to have a saying that you never wanted to be invited to a dinner party at Angela Lansbury's house.
I'll tell you the truth. If I lived in that town, I'd have moved after the second murder. I'm not hanging around to be a target there.
No, folks tend to die around that lady.
Brother. It's surprising the cops didn't maybe take a look at her a little bit, because what's the common denominator there?
Yeah, absolutely.
Now let me be devil's advocate here for just a moment. Do you envision a tidy ending, a complete story arc for Rutledge and Bess, a final send off, or are they going to carry on into infinity? Or do you envision a time where you might get into the Depression era, let's say, or even up to World War II?
Well, one of the things we did wisely, I think, was in both series, we pretty much run the books very close together.
Yeah.
The reason is, if we have too many years that go by, pretty much in Rutledge, for example, it goes, this one's in June, this one's in July.
Yeah.
Because we did not want to wind up in a situation where suddenly Rutledge and Bess were in the old folks' home and still trying to solve murders.
So you're wise enough not to write yourself into a corner, so to speak.
Definitely. Plus, we loved that particular period in history.
It's very rich.
Because it was, well, as Peter Jennings and Tom Brokaw said in their books about the 20th century, it was the pivotal event of the 20th century. We're only just now starting to recognize some of the ramifications that had came out of not only the war, but also the Treaty of Versailles. Everybody writes the Treaty of Versailles off and say, well, that led to World War II. It was stupid. Da, 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 da. They have no concept of how the Balkans remained a problem, how we wound up getting involved in Sarajevo and Yugoslavia and the Serbs and the Croats and all that, how we wound up putting troops into Iraq when it was Kitchener and the Minister of War for France that had, right at the beginning of the war, they pretty much divvied up, okay, France, you get this and I get this and we'll take that. And so the lines were drawn on the map with no regard or understanding to basic things like Shia, Sunni, the fact that they're tribal people and nomads, that it's very difficult. That was a problem we ran into in Afghanistan. Nobody listened to what happened to the British when they went through the Khyber Pass, so we had to find out for ourselves, both the Russians and the Americans.
The Soviets did it too.
These are things that we look at now, and there's an eerie foreshadowing in that Treaty of Versailles where we set ourselves up for a lot of trouble. And so that whole era is absolutely fascinating, and the colossal losses. We have been asked sometimes, why did you set it in England and not the United States? Well, first of all, because we love England and it's a way to travel to England and write it off on our taxes. But
very wise.
England suffered 10 times what we've suffered. The U.S. casualties in World War I were 280,000 people, soldiers. Now, that's nothing compared to almost 1 million British soldiers that were lost, not to mention all the losses from the colonies and everywhere else. We remember back at places like Shiloh during the American Civil War, where Ulysses S. Grant was called a bloodthirsty warmonger because he lost a couple thousand men in the Battle of Shiloh. And then you look at the first day of the Battle of the Somme, 29,000 men died. Can you imagine if that hit the front pages of our newspaper anytime soon?
Unbelievable.
We would absolutely go berserk.
We certainly would.
And they did, and they survived it. And then they turned around 30 years later and did it again.
Yeah.
You know, I like that time period, and Caroline likes that time period. And I've kind of avoided answering your question about what's the future. What's the future right now is I have pretty much completed, and I'm going to be sending off for Rutledge to my agent this week. She's going to take a look at it. The publishers are going to take a look at it. A decision will be made whether or not it lives up to the expectations that I like to think that the two of us together set a pretty high standard for our books.
No question.
And I never want to see that drop.
Diminished at all? Well, I'm sure it won't be, and I'm looking forward to that.
We get our fingers crossed, and we'll worry about what happens to Bess and Rutledge. But as soon as I turn in this Rutledge book, I'm going to start working on the next Bess.
Very good. That's good to hear. I just heard a sigh of relief over the internet from all the people who are watching and waiting for the next Rutledge and the next Bess. So she is of her time, and that's probably a wise thing, because it is a bit tricky proposition to picture her in the later in the 20th century, even the 21st. But with what you were saying about the wider implications that most people don't really think about or understand about the Treaty of Versailles, and the fact that the Western powers went barging into the East and just cut up colonies pell-mell and helter-skelter without the least regard, has led to all kinds of trouble in Africa as well. No regard for tribal territories or anything of that nature, and just cutting lines all over the place and where the oil was and this and that and the other thing. So we might not see Bess leaving the Sepulchred Isle, leaving Merry Old, even for a short adventure and then headed back or anything like that.
Well,
does Bess have a passport?
Bess has gone on some adventures. If you remember, in I believe it was Racing the Devil, when Rutledge reached out through Melinda to Bess to answer a question that he had. They were on a cruise.
Oh, that's right. I remember that now.
So I'm sure they will travel. As far as cases are concerned, it's a lot easier for Bess to travel and bump into something than it is for Rutledge. When we first came up with the idea for Racing the Devil, we were actually in Nice in France. And we had gone from the town up the cliffs, and those are the cliffs where Grace Kelly got in her accident and died. They're not exactly friendly roads even now.
Yeah, I've been there, and those roads are just insane. No way would I try walking them, never mind driving a car.
Well, we went up to this restaurant, and you had a beautiful view out over Nice and the Mediterranean beyond, and we saw that fog start to roll in, where the warm, moist air was bringing in the fog, and the cooler air from the evening was coming out, and it created a fog, and it was building up, and eventually Nice disappeared. When we came out of the restaurant, the fog was all the way up to us. And fortunately, there was a professional driver who drove us back down.
And a good thing, too.
But we were thinking about that, and that was where the kernel was put. What can we do with this? And that's where the race from Paris to Nice was set up by the soldiers in that barn before the battle. Well, that's lovely, but Rutledge can't investigate that case.
True.
It's in France. He's a British Scotland Yard inspector. He can't.
There might be a jurisdiction problem there.
Yeah. So we said, okay, how can we keep this story but make it relevant in England? And that's when the captain's car got smashed and the vicar got killed and all kinds of nasty things started happening.
There was some unpleasantness. Yes, that was a good story. You all should check that out. We're talking from the Mysterious Bookshop. I'm Mike Durrell. We're talking to Mr. Charles Todd, the author, or you might say co-author, of the new Bess Crawford mystery, The Cliff's Edge, available here at the Mysterious Bookshop in signed first editions. So thanks for that, Charles.
I always think of myself as a co-author.
And so you should. Is there anything you'd care to add?
Absolutely not. Mike, it's been a pleasure as always.
It's my pleasure, sir. As I say, folks, just one more time, we are coming to you from the Mysterious Bookshop in New York City. We're talking with Charles Todd of his new book, The Cliff's Edge, featuring Bess Crawford, who has had all kinds of adventures. Also, check out the Ian Rutledge series, especially Racing the Devil, which I really like, and the new one that I really liked as well. And as I say, you can get it here. Check it out, mysteriousbookshop.com, 212-587-1011. That number again, 212-587-1011.
And I always say, support your local independent bookseller.
Do. It's a good thing. Support. I freely admit my bias because I've been working in stores most of my working life, but it's a good thing. So
it is.
Do check us out.
They get to know you and make recommendations accordingly. It's a relationship worth developing.
It really is. It really is. So check out your local bookseller. Talk to them. We can recommend two, not one, but two excellent series from Mr. Todd. We can recommend lots of other stuff. So come on in, email us, check out our website if you're not around. And I would like to thank you very much for being with us tonight. And I hope that people who are tuning into this will avail themselves of the opportunity, not only to check us out, but Mr. Todd's works and those with Caroline, his late mother, in the bargain.
And we have The Cliff's Edge right here.
Check it out. Zoom in there. I don't know if we can. And oh, here it comes. Here it comes. It's the manual zoom.
The hand zoom.
Hand zoom. That's it. The Cliff's Edge. Brand new from, refresh my memory as to your publisher.
William Morrow.
That's right. That's right. Brand new from William Morrow. We have signed first editions. We have lots of other stuff. Check us out. Check out the works of Mr. Todd. And I see that our time is running short. Any final remarks, Charles?
Not at all. Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you for being here with us.
Getting to visit you in the Gardenia room.
In the Gardenia
room.
On
the penthouse floor of the Roosevelt.
Say again?
That's on the penthouse floor of the Roosevelt.
I believe so. As a matter of fact,
in Tribeca, but
theirs was in the penthouse room in the Roosevelt Hotel. Ours is in the basement room of the Mysterious Bookshop. But hey, it all comes out in the end. All right. I hope that you'll pardon my mouthful of gauze from a missing tooth and my shaky vocals today, but we had a very nice conversation, and I'm sure we will do so again in the very near future. Thanks for listening, everyone. Check out Mysterious Bookshop at your leisure. Check out Charles Todd. Check out me, Mike Durrell. We appreciate your tuning in. Let us know any comments or questions you may have, and we'll talk to you very soon. Thank you, everyone, and good night.
Thank you.